Welcome again to our near-death experience interview series. I'm Robert Mays. Suzanne and I have researched near-death experiences for the past 15 years. We are interviewing people who have had an NDE and who have also received visions of future world events. This series is part of our research project, which was approved by the Academic and Research Committee of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. In these interviews, we're exploring NDErs' insights into the deeper meaning of the challenges currently facing humanity, such as the pandemic and the social and political polarization of society. What advice do NDErs have for coping with and responding to these challenges? We'll pause here to bring in today's guest.
We are here again, happily, with Rabbi Stephen Robbins of Congregation Neve Shalom in Los Angeles. He is also co-founder of the Academy for Jewish Religion, California, the first trans-denominational rabbinic and cantorial school. Stephen is also a clinical psychologist with a specialty in the psychoneuroimmunology of trauma, which brings together the spiritual, the physical, and brain development to help patients respond to trauma. Stephen has had a total of 7 NDEs in his life. During each NDE, he received a prophetic vision, a message, or a mission. We will continue to explore these in this session. Welcome, Rabbi Robbins.
Again, thank you for making these videos possible and for me to be able to express verbally, which I do much better than writing, my experiences and what I learned as a result of them and how to fulfill the messages that I received.
Stephen, your first NDE occurred at your birth in May 1944, and your second NDE occurred in June 1964 from hepatitis.
Correct.
And the third NDE occurred in 1987 from complications from influenza.
Correct.
So these we've covered in our early interviews. Can you describe your fourth NDE? When and how did it occur?
In December, January of 91 to 92, again, I caught a cold. It went back into my severely damaged lungs, and I had severe bouts of coughing and eventually ended up back in the hospital with lung collapse and an NDE again. And in this one, it took several months to recover, but the NDE itself had some very powerful lessons. The first was that I was going to leave what I call industrial strength Judaism behind, to stop trying to teach spirituality and morality and ethics to an already existing congregation that I was serving in Beverly Hills. I was scheduled to become the senior rabbi by 93. And I said to my wife, they're never going to let me do it because I'm too radical, too different, both too traditional and too creative and too publicly known. And the older founders were not happy with the direction I had taken the congregation, which had grown under my leadership along with the people who founded the day school and the head of the religious department in general. And the synagogue had grown from approximately 700 families when I started to over 1,500 families when I left after all the contention. But instead of fighting to stay, I realized that there was no way I could stay after what I went through. So it was important to leave with my integrity and my dignity, which is what I was told was more important than any position I had.
So,
And so I left and began doing what I'm doing now. And that was to start a synagogue with my wife, who became the cantor, Neve Shalom, which means oasis of peace, teaching Kabbalah, meditation, and healing at the University of Judaism, and then starting a practice in the psycho-spiritual, mystical forms of healing, which had been taught to me in 87, 91, and began integrating that with my training in Gestalt, psychodrama, and in body therapy that I learned from a woman named Ida Rolf and her students. And I developed all of the healing systems that I will talk about when it's time.
Okay, so let me interrupt here. The directive, or directive or tikkun that you received in 91 in your NDE, that was to leave, or was what exactly was?
No, it wasn't that I was to leave. It's that I would be given the choice to fight to stay or to leave with dignity and integrity intact and enter a whole new phase in which I would be serving Jewish community rather than just a single synagogue and an ideology. Okay. And so they said that my tikkun was to step into my own unique identity rather than to be tied to a big institution, and to follow the healing path that I had been set on since my birth and the other NDEs, and begin to step forward and not to hide, which I've been doing.
So this, and it seems like this healing path is as you say, was almost like a life destiny that you had from the time of your birth, and that this NDE gave you another direction, and I guess it was your choice to follow that.
Yes, I was reminded that my grandmother, speaking for my great-grandfather and the rest of my family, to not speak about anything that I knew mystically until the turn of the century, when I would not be considered crazy. And since it was in the mid-90s, it was the appropriate time to do that. And I had established myself as a rabbi in the community with my own credentials. I didn't need a synagogue anymore to give me a platform. And so I decided to, as my wife put it, reinvent myself, or to follow the real tikkun that had me become a very individualistic practitioner of what I had learned so many years ago in the NDE experiences and from my ancestors. And I began teaching breath techniques and meditation techniques to release people from their own psycho-spiritual limitations. And there's some pretty amazing stories about things that happen to people, most of which are now being put down into narratives and videos by those people. There are those who went through profound transformations in the classes and the practice that I had that really astounded me. So I can talk in more detail about the healing if you want me to.
Actually, what I'd like to understand is how your NDE gave, or your NDEs, since you've had these problems with breathing and with your lungs for most of your life, that actually in the when you were born and the doctor breathed into you, and so how did those did those experiences give you the insights that you use now?
There is a verse in Genesis 2:7 that says, Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et Adam afar. And the verb Vayitzer is translated, and God created. But it really means God compacted Adam out of the afar, the particles of existence, which, as I told you before, are all the different colors of the earth from the earth. So Adam is not created from particles of the earth. He is Adam afar, a human of the particles, which would be from the possibilities of the earth. And then it says, Vayipach bi'apav nishmat chayim, and he blew into Adam's nose the neshama, the unique soul of living. It's translated as the soul of life, but the verb chayim is living, not life. And Adam became a living being, which is that understanding that instead of taking a breath, is that we receive a breath, which is how I began.
Right.
The urgency of that doctor to keep me alive by infusing in his breath the necessity for me to live in this world, and the sense that his breath contained more than just his breath, but it was a vehicle for my soul to enter me. And he did it, he explained to me, not out of the sense that he was going to keep me alive, but that whatever had directed him to breathe into me was to do it with a sense of joy and gratitude, rather than with a sense of urgency and fear.
Right, and then you had this experience in your third NDE that you realized, this is when you had this influenza and were struggling to breathe, that you then felt once you left your body that you didn't need to breathe. Is that?
Yeah, that's what I reflected before. The experience of what I call discorporation, in which, you pass through walls and all of that. But in that, and suddenly realizing I'm not breathing because I'm not in my body. And since 10 to 15% of both my lungs are permanently collapsed, the struggle to breathe, which was part of the limitations I have living in this world even to now, were gone. And I came to this enormous experience of not having to breathe in order to be, because breath sustains the body and the brain. It doesn't sustain consciousness.
Right.
One of the things we know physiologically is that when the left ventricle and auricle express the oxygenated blood, the majority of that oxygen goes into the brain, because the brain needs the oxygen in order to function. And so suddenly realize that I no longer needed to oxygenate my brain or my body, which is what freed me from any fear of leaving because I was no longer dependent on breath. And that relief, as well as the relief from pain and struggle, was such joy, such celebration, such song, such dance. I was soaring. The words in Hebrew are not relevant here, but I was lifted up and I was flying with my guides, and all of us were singing and celebrating, and I was singing without breath. My singing came out of my consciousness. I never had a great voice anyway, but the voice that emerged from my consciousness was a beautiful voice that I had never heard before. Wow. Even when I was playing the guitar and backing up folk song groups, this voice that came from me was pure because it wasn't contained in the constrictions of my damaged lungs, a constricted diaphragm, the constriction in my throat and my vocal cords, which is what I deal with now every day since coming back into my body. And if I can find it now, because I'm still trying to deal with clearing it. When I can find that clarity. And receive a breath rather than struggle to take it, so that the Holy One breathes into me at every moment. And then surrender myself all that's physical, so that I am willing to no longer be. And then a pause in which there is a yichud, a union back of my soul in this world to the source from which it came. And then instead of panicking to take another breath, I simply am breathed into again. And those are 3 of the 5 dimensions of the soul. So inhale or inspire, which is the right word. Inspire means to be breathed into with knowledge that we didn't know and is given to us. So the inspire is right brain. In Kabbalah, that's called chokhmah. It's consciousness that can interact with the brain. The exhale is nefesh, which is the physical body, giving it back so that if there is the choice to return it or not, leave that to the Holy One. And in that pause with the triangle, when I don't breathe, there is this yichud, this union, in which I feel myself relaxing and my breathing issues begin to diminish, as I think you heard. And that's called neshama. That is that unique soul being. So I have taught this three-sided breathing to several thousand people of different faiths, and it works. And instead of the Asian breathing, which is inhale, pause, and the exhale is forcing it out. This is like an isosceles triangle. Inhale, exhale, and then pause. And we know this breathing because this is infant breathing. If you remember when your children and mine were infants and we'd go in the middle of the night to check on them. And they would go like this. And we would begin to get worried. And then they'd go.
Okay.
And that's a breathing we all already know. It is the breathing of an infant who is not afraid of losing breath. And the experience in the womb through the placenta of being breathed into by mother, sharing breath, is then transferred to the infant as the infant enters the world. The problem at that point is, how does the infant move from the trauma of being breathed into by mother to learning to receive a breath rather than struggle for it? And the answer is given in a research project done by Dr. Alan Shore, which is in his book on infant development and the sources of identity, in which there is a series of videos shot of a mother breastfeeding an infant. And the general perception is that an infant doesn't see anything at birth, but that's not accurate. The infant has about a 7 to 10 inch focal length, enough so that when the infant latches on to the nipple, there is an enormous outflow from the mother's brain of oxytocin, which creates this enormous peace and joy and bonding. And the mother's eyes dilate in this sense of wonder. And within a nanosecond afterwards, what the video shows is that the infant's pupils also dilate. And what the scientists say is that they are looking into each other's soul. And so this infant bonding done by eye contact, not by the nipple, is the source of the development of the early stages of the infant brain. And that really sets off the issue of what bonding truly is and helps define the nature of intimacy and later empathy for the child. And if that initial bonding is disrupted by any one of a number of physical, psychological, or even spiritual issues, then bonding becomes everything from intermittent to rejective to avoidant. And that's the source of so many of the personality disorders that we learn about when we read in the DSM, the manual of psychiatric disorders. And it is this bonding and the sucking and the eye contact which lets the infant know that it can live in its own independence. So that breathing belongs to the infant, but the breath is the same breath given, not taken. And when I was breathed into by the doctor, I received the love that was in that breath. And I never felt that love again, regardless of all of the women I kissed, etc., until I kissed my wife. And that first kiss breathed into me a living that had been buried in me for decades. And she brought me to life. And without that, I would not have been teaching and practicing and going through what I'm talking to you now. So that when we truly kiss the one we love, regardless of gender, there is the sense of the joy of sharing soul that's contained in the breath, so that we breathe in and out of each other as we're kissing or talking or holding. And it is this eye contact that generates the joy, and our eyes dilate, particularly and most intensely when we're making love and we look into each other's eyes at the moment of ecstasy, rather than close our eyes and go away on our own. That's even part of Kundalini yoga. The need to attach in moments of joy, not just in moments of sorrow and struggle. Excuse my voice. Healing begins in receiving the breath that inspires, and in that inspiration to know that you are being loved and breathed into, rather than taking a breath. Because as one of my teachers, Abraham Joshua Heschel, said, whoever has what they have by taking it may have what they've taken, but they've done it by conflict. Those who have received what they've been given have not only what they've received, but most importantly, they have the love of the one who gave it. And that is always greater than the gift itself.
So you would consider breathing then is probably the most precious gift the human being has.
Yes.
That it's a gift of grace.
Yeah, it is a gift of love, and grace meaning God providing it in an unlimited flow.
Because there are years who come back from their experience and they say that our breathing is the most precious gift we have.
Exactly. And when you have people like me with severe lung disorders who learn to overcome them, so that after my second NDE in 91, I began bicycling so that I was doing long distance road biking, 100 to 200 miles in a day. And I was doing high altitude mountain biking from Vail to Aspen along the Continental Divide. And the doctor said I would never be able to do that, to which my response is, you want to bet? And I realized that like the liver, which regenerates, the lungs can regenerate if you persist in using them. It is when you surrender to your lung condition that it only gets worse. And so I never did. Now we're facing in the COVID crisis this enormous challenge to the lungs, and learning to deal with breath differently than we have ever done before. And the preciousness of breath, especially for those who are the NDErs from COVID, come out of it knowing that their breath will never be the same, that they have lung damage, which is unknown as of yet, and how long it will last. The projections are that it may compromise breathing, asthma-like symptoms, susceptibility to colds and flus that they never had before? And at the same time, will they surrender to it, or will they be victorious over it by persisting to move beyond the limitations that the doctors say they'll never pass? And that comes with learning not to struggle to take a breath, but to be relaxed and at peace and receive a breath. So even at the most difficult times of my climbing mountains or road biking up to Santa Barbara and back, that when I was at the height of breathing intensely, I was not ever struggling to take a breath. I was receiving whatever breath there was to breathe into me. And that is how I was able to bike at 11 to 12, even 13,000 feet, when people with my condition are generally told, don't leave sea level. So it is learning that our spiritual consciousness, using our brains and connecting with the anatomical, physiological, biological structures of our autonomic system and our immune system, can in fact get us to move beyond the trauma and into a healing phase. And that's going to be the major task that we NDErs face with all of those who come out of their NDEs and COVID, is being able to support them to live their lives without fear and not becoming invalids, but being those who learn to overcome their infirmities by receiving healing, not trying to make it.
Would you consider the COVID virus now having a higher meaning to it compared to any of the other viruses that we've had before? Is it different than the flu viruses? And therefore there is a real kind of global message with this particular pandemic that is much different than any of the other flu problems we've had.
I was told that in January of 18, when I had my 6th NDE, and afterwards I went out and bought a handful of N95 masks for my wife and myself. And I was warned that the world was disintegrating, and that humans had broken down the structure of the physical world, that not only climate change, but the destruction of species, the burning down of forests, which were the lungs of the earth, was changing the nature of air and all the pollution we lived with. And I can tell you, being born and growing up in Los Angeles, which was the worst cesspool of smog in the 50s, that's where my lung damage began, because there were days when the smog was so bad, believe it or not, in Santa Monica, in the canyons, that eyes were burning and couldn't breathe. There was agony in our lungs, and the schools closed and sent us home. My blessing was that our house lived above that cloud level. So when I would come home, the air would be clear. Of course, that's no longer true. But because of the California creation of the Air Quality Management Board, while there's so much pollution still in Los Angeles, it's basically from cars. But all of the manufacturing moved east and south. And so now the smog sits most intensely around the mountains to the south and east, because there's no place for it to go. I remember driving in each summer from Vail with my family, and we'd get to the Highway 15 pass that went down to connect with the 10. And I'd get there and I'd stop, and there would be this brown blanket laying over the city. And after a month of living in this incredibly pure air and the freedom in my breathing, to know that not only myself, but my wife and my children were going to re-enter this cesspool. And it was always painful and difficult.
So, but getting back to the pandemic, and this particular, you were shown something that prompted you to get the N95 masks.
And yeah, and what it showed me was that there was going to be an illness. I didn't have specifics. That was going to go around the world like flu, but that it would be something that no one had ever seen before. And the challenge was going to be that it was going to come out of the breakdown that we had been building between humans and animals and the natural world. And that's what SARS and coronaviruses are. They're the result of the breakdown between animals and humans. And we're going back to living as animals, not living as humans, because there are so many of us. We'll eat anything we can get a hold of. So blaming China for the virus is absurd. It is that all of humanity set this up, and it is now an illness not by nations, but it is an illness of all of humanity. And the worst perpetrators of maintaining the ignorance about all of this is the United States, which used to be the leader in health and wellness, and good medical care is now become a laughing stock, and we're worse off than any other country in the world. So that we persist in being the cesspool that produces and supports the virus rather than one that confronts it. And so that the second wave that comes around, and then a third wave, and in each wave, the virus learns more and more how to morph itself into fitting in the different structures of the cellular functions of the human body. And that's the perniciousness of viruses. Remember, they begin as inert, almost alien structures until they enter the body either through the nose or the mouth or the hands and the eyes or the breath, all of the things that we settle with masks and even face shields and gloves and hand washing. But when we persist in not doing that, we become the petri dish for these viruses to practice. One of the best examples is AIDS. Yeah. We found with AIDS, as we did with Ebola later and later with hantavirus, that these viruses change their nature to fit the unique DNA of the host that they're in, which is why there is no vaccine for AIDS. There are only remedies which extend life, but the nature and the quality of life diminishes severely. It was the past administration that jumped on the issue of Ebola and the hantavirus and others, and were able to help contain it, not for the United States, but for the world. And instead of the United States jumping on this, it withdrew. And there is this sense that I was given there, that this is the attempt of a certain class of people and their color to try and maintain their hegemony in a world in which they're disappearing, and that other peoples are now expanding and they need a place to go for refuge. The way my grandparents came here for a place of refuge, which is what the poem on the Statue of Liberty is about. So that this virus is a challenge to humanity, whether or not humanity will choose to live or whether it will isolate itself in its own national well-being and therefore expand not only the virus's capacity itself, but will tear down what we see happening now, the economic structure of the world, and then the expansion of poverty and homelessness and the inability to treat those people who end up with the virus itself, so that all that had begun, especially in the United States, with the increase in property values, meaning that people can no longer afford to live, is only a replication of what we see in other countries around the world. The months I spent in India twice watching all of the shanties built around these large modern apartment buildings is what's happening here. And it is so tragic in a country that has more than enough resources to home, to house, to feed, and to treat every single citizen. And yet there is the lack of will, not just in this government, but in the population to take this challenge seriously. And so in the next rounds of this virus, I was told, is the spiritual, psychological, moral, and ethical will not to fight the virus, but to transcend all that has led us to this place, not just to save ourselves, but to save the world around us. I mean, if you see the number of advertising on the TV for saving abused animals and tigers and elephants, and for us in California, the burning of those forests, most of which are national forests, is so tragic. I mean, I spent weeks in those forests, camping, hunting, just being outdoors. And it's so sad. And of course, the smoke from all of those fires just pour across the LA basin. And I've had some real difficulty breathing because of it. So, and all of us individually feel helpless. So we try and do the best that we can to survive. You know, I'm reminded of the challenge that came with smoking and this stupidity that the five gnomes from the tobacco companies could stand up in Congress and lie. And the solution to it was, at least what happened in LA, was that I'd be in a restaurant, somebody would sit down next to me to smoke. And instead of my getting up and leaving, I said, don't do that next to me, leave. And more people in LA began doing that, so that people who smoked were no longer welcomed by the other patrons in the restaurant. And that happened more and more until finally there was a ban on smoking. And that has to come not from the government, but from the populace who says, no more, we will not do this. And there is, you know, the infection rate in California has now become steady instead of peaking. And it's because more and more in California, people are understanding the need to mask, to wash, etc. But there is still that element who says, I will do my rights. I will follow the president. I will walk around unmasked, etc. And then they get sick and they die. So do we have as the spiritual guides, the malachim, the messengers from the throne itself said, as the parable I gave you, that God says to Adam, I now give all of this to you. It's in your hands. It is up to you whether it sustains and grows or whether it dies. And Adam says, well, if we don't do it, who will fix it? And God said, no one. And Adam says, not you. And God says, not even me. It is up to you and your partnership with each other and your partnership with me to sustain and tend the garden that you've been given, or else it will wither and die. And that's where we are right now. And the biggest virus on this planet are humans, who will ingest anything regardless of what it will do to them. So this virus, or these kinds of viruses that morph and change, is not just a physical challenge. It is an ethical challenge. It is a psychological, but most of all, it is a spiritual challenge as to whether or not, as I said before, we don't see people's skin. We see what's within them, and that we are all the same, struggling to accomplish the same thing. As John Kennedy said so many years ago, we all inhabit the same small planet. We all have families. We wish the same for our children. And we need to create unity in the world. There are very few people who have echoed in such eloquence what he said. And to take that stand is what is the important piece that this virus and its subsequent morphing is going to challenge us with.
We need to stop. We are way over time.
Did I answer your question?
Oh, yes.
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 Thank you very much.
Especially for our friends, people that we know who say, well, this virus is no different than previous flu seasons.
No. That's the lies propagated by the people who want this to continue. Because quite frankly, it by and large is killing people of color who are poor and uneducated and who have no access to health care. And that suits them just fine.
We're going to need to continue this discussion in another session. So thank you very much.
And thank you again, with much gratitude. I'll put it this way. You are breathing into me and inspiring me to find the words to speak out.
Well, thank you. And you have provided us with tremendous inspiration. Thank you.
God bless. I will see you soon.